Good afternoon. It's day 3 of the salute to Black Black History Month. Day 3, of course, not of Black History Month, but day 3 of the reading of lynching in America from the Equal Justice Initiative. We read another piece from the Equal Justice Initiative the entire month. I'm looking to salute to the research that's done by the Equal Justice Initiative. We're on chapter 2, back to brutality and lynching in America. Back to brutality, restoring racial hierarchy through terror and violence. Racial terrorism and the intimidation of African Americans became characteristic of the Southern democracy. And of course, all of these pieces that I've read will be both on YouTube, secured, and also on my blog. Racial terrorism and intimidation of African Americans have become characteristic of Southern democracy during the 1870s and prompted little action from the federal observers. A proposal in Congress to discipline Georgia for the violence and corruption surrounding its 1870 election was defeated by a 5-day filibuster in the Senate, and Northern support for federal intervention on the behalf of black people living in the South diminished considerably. In 1872, Congress returned full civil rights to Confederate leaders and restored their eligibility to hold public office. The Amnesty Act was passed over the objection of Congressman Jefferson Long, born into slavery in 1836, elected in 1870 as Georgia's first black representative in the United States Congress. Long became the first black person to speak on the House floor when he opposed amnesty. On that day, Representative Long said, "Do we then propose here today, when the country is not ready for it, when those disloyal people still hate the government, when loyal men dare not carry the stars and stripes through our streets, for if they do, they will be turned out of employment to relieve from political disability the very men who have committed these Ku Klux outrages. I think that I am going to do my duty to my constituents and my duty to my country when I vote against any such proposal. Mr. Speaker, I propose as a man raised as a slave, my mother a slave before me, my ancestry slaves as far back as I can trace them. If this House removes the disability of loyal men by modifying the test oath, I venture to prophesy you will again have trouble from the very same men who gave you trouble before." Long's warning, Representative Long that is, his warning went unheeded. Even before the Reconstruction officials' end, Confederate veterans espousing white supremacist rhetoric were able to employ violent intimidation to regain political control over many Southern governments. In Virginia, a former Confederate general, James M. Kemper, was inaugurated as governor in 1874, and that same year delivered an address to the General Assembly of Virginia outlining the racial regime he intended to create. Henceforth, let it be understood of all that the political equality of the races is settled, and the social equality of the races is a settled impossibility. Let it be understood of all that any organized attempt on the part of the weaker and relatively diminishing race to dominate the domestic governments is the wildest chimera of political insanity. Let each race settle down in a final resignation to the lot to which the logic of events has exorbitantly consigned it. Confederate Colonel James Milton Smith, who became Georgia's governor in 1872, held similar statements. In an 1876 interview published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Smith opted on the status of black people, then approximately 46% of his supposed constituents within the state of Georgia. Well, the loss of the slaves was a severe blow to the South. Still, we shouldn't be just as well off without them were the Negro race less indolent and unreliable. They are constitutionally an idle, thriftless race, also depending on whites for everything. And it will take a century of education before they can be brought up to the standard that will make them in any degree useful members of the community. Things are not much better outside the South, as the Supreme Court continued to chip away at the federal Reconstruction laws. In 1875, Congress passed Senator Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Act, which mandated desegregation and imposed criminal penalties for racial discrimination and jury selection, but the Crunch Act decision left little legal basis to enforce desegregation provisions. And in 1883, the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. The next decade, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court, that is the Supreme Court, would uphold racial segregation as fully consistent with the 14th Amendment and create the doctrine of separate but equal. Executive action, that's presidential. The presidential action was also waned during this period as Southern racial violence became an increasingly divisive issue, and politically weakened President Ulysses S. Grant became more and more reluctant to intervene. When Mississippi Governor Adelbert Ames requested federal troops to suppress intense violence during the state elections in Mississippi, Grant sent an expedited letter encouraging Ames to broker a peace agreement between the state militia and the white mobs, writing that the whole public are tarred out with these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South. Basically, Grant saying that not the whole public, but the white public, not the whole public of America were tired out, but the white public, the northern whites, the southern whites, they gave their sons and daughters of the Union and the Confederacy gave their lives, and still, white mobs are going to do what they're going to do. So, as a president, would you just simply tell your militias to leave those white mobs alone? Let them do their justice. Without federal protection, black voters were targeted in brutal attacks on Election Day in Mississippi and throughout the South. The presidential election of 1876 resulted in a deadlock between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Congress and the Supreme Court brokered a compromise under which Hayes would become president if he promised to end Reconstruction. Within 2 months of taking office, President Turncoat Hayes took action to end the federal troops' role in Southern politics. And in the words of Henry Adams, a black man living in Louisiana at the time, the whole South, every state in the South, had got into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves. On the defeat of Reconstruction, the Nation newspaper offered a solemn assessment. The Negro will disappear from the fields of national politics. Henceforth, the nation as a nation will have nothing more to do with him. For millions of black men, women, and children, the abandonment foretold a grim feature. They are to be returned to the condition of serfdom, predicted Governor Ames of Mississippi, an era of second slavery. After Reconstruction, unequal again. And remember, I'm reading chapter 2, Back to Brutality, Lynching in America. The presence of federal troops in the South during the Reconstruction era acted as a penetrable dam holding back some of the violence, political suppression, and racist rhetoric employed by those intent on restoring white supremacist rule. Their premature withdrawal unleashed a pent-up wave of violence that easily topped the few remaining protective structures and left black people cemented in an inferior economic, social, and political position. Southern state governments set to work altering their constitutions to disenfranchise black citizens and codify slavery. So, after this period of 12 years, 1865 through 1877, the southern states, those former Confederate states, basically said, okay, we lost the war, but we didn't lose the fight. We will put the black people back in their place of subjugation. And although we won't have legalized slavery, we will have a form of slavery that more will be more deeply volatile for black citizens. At the 1890 Mississippi Constitutional Convention, we're all but one of the delegates were white. The intentional purging of black people from the rolls of eligible voters was a top priority. Analyzing the state's electoral system 6 years later, the Mississippi Supreme Court readily acknowledged these motivations. In the highest degree improbable that there was not a consistent, controlling, directing purpose governing the convention by which these schemes were elaborated and fixed in the Constitution. Within the field of permissible action under the limitations imposed by the federal Constitution, the convention swept the circle of expedients to obstruct the exercise of the franchise of voting by the Negro race. By reason of its previous condition of servitude and dependence, this race had acquired and accentuated certain particularities of habit, of temperament, and of character, which clearly distinguished it as a race from that of the whites, a patient, docile people, but careless, landless, and migratory within narrow limits, without forethought, and with its criminal members given rather to further offenses than to robust crimes of the whites. Restrained by the federal Constitution from discriminating against the Negro race, the convention discriminated against its characteristics and the offenses to which its weaker members were prone. Alabama rewrote its constitution in 1901. John B. Knox, a Calhoun County lawyer and president of the Constitutional Convention, opened the proceedings with a statement of purpose. Why is it within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in this state? Now that the political power had been regained, legalized racial subordination could and would be restored. If we would have white supremacy, Knox explained, we must establish it by law, not by force of fraud. From 1885 to 1908, all 11 former Confederate states rewrote their constitutions to include provisions restricting voting rights with poll taxes, literacy tests, and felon disenfranchisement. Many of these new constitutions also included segregationist prohibitions against interracial marriage and integrated public education. Over the ensuing decade, aided by convict leasing and Jim Crow laws, emboldened by the federal government's disinterest in enforcing. Remember, the federal government basically said, okay, you former Confederate states, we give you back your land, we give you back your white power, and you do what you want with the Negroes. We don't care. Well, they were emboldened by the federal government's disinterest in enforcing the racial equality guaranteed by the federal Constitution. Supposedly the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments secured those rights. Southern legislatures institutionalized the racial inequality enshrined in their state constitutions. The state created a system of state and local laws and practices that constituted a pervasive and deep-rooted racial caste system. The era of second slavery had officially begun. Convict leasing. Convict leasing, the practice of selling the labor of state and local prisoners to private interests for state profit, utilize the criminal justice system, because you got to remember that the 13th Amendment said that slavery was banned except for imprisonment. Utilize the criminal justice system to effectuate the economic exploitation and political disempowerment of black people. State legislators passed discriminatory laws or black codes, which created new criminal offenses such as vagrancy and loitering. And this led to the mass arrest and incarceration of black people. Relying on the language in the 13th Amendment that prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, lawmakers empowered white-controlled governments to extract black labor in private lease contracts or on state-owned farms. While a black prisoner was a rarity during slavery, the slavery era, when slave masters were individually empowered to administer discipline to their human property. The solution to the free black population had become criminalization. In turn, the most common fate facing black convicts was to be sold into forced labor for the profit of the state. Beginning as early as 1866 in states like Texas, the Juneteenth state, Mississippi, and Georgia, convict leasing spread throughout the southern states and continued through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In contrast to white prisoners who were routinely sentenced to penitentiary, leased black convicts faced deplorable, unsafe working conditions and brutal violence when they attempted to resist or escape bondage. An 1887 report by the Hinds County, Mississippi grand jury recorded that 6 months after 204 convicts were leased to a man named McDonald, 20 were dead, 19 had escaped, 23 had been returned to the penitentiary, disabled, ill, or near death. The penitentiary hospital was filled with sick and dying black men whose bodies bore the marks of the most inhumane and brutal treatment. So poor and emaciated that their bones almost came through their skins. You remember seeing those pictures of how the Nazis treated the Jewish population and the gypsies during World War II? Well, that's how white men treated blacks after Reconstruction. So poor and emaciated that their bones almost came through their skin. Under this grotesquely cruel system that lasted decades, countless black men, women, and children lost their freedom and often their lives. Before convict leasing officially ended, writes historian David Alinsky, a generation of black prisoners would suffer and die under conditions far worse than anything they ever experienced as slaves. You got to understand that statement. A generation of black prisoners would suffer and die under conditions far worse than anything they faced as slaves. After Reconstruction, the South created a system of oppression that was worse than enslavement. And enslavement was the worst of all. So when you start thinking about reparations, understand that slavery didn't end in 1865. A worse form of it began after Black Reconstruction. Convict leasing demonstrated the way in which the criminal justice system would become the central institution for sustaining racial dominance and hierarchy in America. It legitimized excessive punishment and abuse of African Americans and terrorized people of color. And then we have Jim and Jane Crow. You know Jim and Jane Crow? You know the Crows? Down the street, the Crows, down the street in the suburbs where all the white folks live. The Crows were there. And Jim Crow laws prescribed the lives and possibilities of proscribed the lives and possibility of black people throughout the South. The term Jim Crow initially referred to the style of minstrel shows in which white performers caricatured black life for the entertainment of white audiences. Blackface. And by 1890, the term was used to describe the subordination and separation of black people in the South. Much of it codified and much of it still enforced by custom, habit, and violence. Under Jim Crow rules, all aspects of life were governed by a strict color line. You know, white colored. From the most central and important things, public education was segregated throughout the South, and interracial marriage was criminalized. To the most mundane and tedious of things, the water fountains were even colorized. In South Carolina, a 1917 law required that all circuses and other tent events maintain separate entrances and ticket booths for black and white attendees, and imposed a maximum $500 fine for noncompliance. A 1915 law required that black and white employees of cotton textile mills be segregated at every stage of employment and restricted them from using the same entry and exit, occupying the same stairwell, or using the same tools. And this same type of Jim Crow legalization moved into federal government by President Woodrow Wilson. You know, Woodrow Wilson, supposedly the man who was about peace, who wanted to create the League of Nations excluding black people, of course. A 1924 law, a 1915 law required that, you know, we talked about that at every stage, restricted them from using the same exit and entry. A 1924 law effectively outlawed interracial pool halls by declaring that no license would be issued to a billiard room owner who intended his establishment to be patronized by customers of another race. Another 1910 law prohibited placing a white child in the permanent custody of a black adult. Similarly, Florida law required the separation of races on streetcars. Mississippi law mandated separate hospital entrances for white and black patients. North Carolina law authorized librarians to create separate reading areas for black patrons. And Alabama law prohibited white nurses from treating black male patients. In March of 1901, a white woman and black man were arrested in Atlanta, Georgia, after two police officers claimed to have seen them talking and walking together on the street. Interviewed following her arrest, the white woman was indignant not at the law, but at the suggestion that she would ever share the company of a black man in public. "I stopped, and a police officer asked why I talked to a Negro," she told the press. "I told him I was a Southern-born woman, and his insinuations were an insult. He then said he would have to arrest me, and I was ridden to the police barracks in a patrol wagon. It's the first time I'd ever been taken of the kind, and I've been humiliated and disgraced. But somebody will suffer for this before it is done with." Racial segregation also translated into total exclusion of black people from public facilities, institutions, and opportunities. This separation plainly disadvantaged black people and served as a constant symbol of their inferior position in Southern society. Black Southerners were left to brood over the message imparted by the Jim Crow laws and in the spirit in which they were enforced. For all African Americans, Jim Crow was a daily affront, a daily reminder of the distinctive place white folks had marked out for them, a confirmation of their inferiority and baseness in the eyes of the dominant population. The law made no exceptions based on class or education. Indeed, it didn't matter if you were a rich black man or a poor black man, a rich black woman or a poor black woman. You were black, and thus you were less of a person. The laws, the laws functioned on one level to remind African Americans that no matter how they were educated, wealthy or respectable they might be, it did nothing to entitle them to equal treatment with the poorest and most degraded whites. What the white South insisted upon was so much separation of the races as subordination, a system of controls in which whites prescribed the rules of racial conduct and contact and melted out the punishments. Those legally emancipated from slavery and endowed with constitutional rights to participate in society as full citizens. Black people learned that those rights were unenforceable in a white-controlled political system hostile to the exercise. This message was communicated through an intricate and complex system of racial subordination built after the Civil War to maintain and reinforce white supremacy in a world without chattel slavery. constructed of law and custom, force and fear, disenfranchisement, convict leasing, and Jim Crow segregation, the system was fragile and fiercely guarded. Over a century that this racial caste system reigned, perceived violations of this racial order were met with brutal violence targeted at black Americans, and lynching was the weapon of choice. And that's the end of chapter 2. We will be picking up chapter 3, Lynching in America, from popular justice to racial terror, Lynching in America, by the Equal Justice Initiative. My salute to Black History Month. The Black Baller here. Thank you.